I'm Adam Weil, Creative Director of White Rabbit Group. I welcome you to the Pixel Perfect podcast, where we share knowledge, experiences, and motivations from creatives and entrepreneurs. Today, we have an incredible guest who's on a mission to help agencies and consultancies master the art of profitability. Marcel Petitpas is the CEO and co-founder of Parakeeto, a company that specializes in helping agencies measure and improve their profitability through precision and efficiency. As a best-selling author, keynote speaker, and consultant, Marcel has worked with thousands of agencies and professional service firms worldwide, giving them the tools and the insights they need to really thrive. So right now, he's the creator of Parakeeto's integrated profit management system, which breaks down the outdated silos between finance, operations, and new biz to help agencies find that sustainable success. And that's not all. When Marcel isn't working with agencies to help them improve profitability, he's a weightlifting and biohacking enthusiast, a part-time beekeeper, and a true expert in his field. So super stoked to talk with you today, share your insights. Marcel, welcome.
Adam, I appreciate you having me. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, man. Well, yeah, let's start with the journey. I want to hear, share a little bit about your journey. What inspired you to start Parakeeto? Let's start there.
Well, I first got in touch with this problem when I ran a very, very small agency myself. Back in 2015, 2016, I was doing virtual tours for real estate before you could do it with your iPhone. So, we go into a house, we had a DSLR camera with a wide angle lens and a special mount for the tripod. And we would take a whole bunch of pictures in a circle and then take those back and stitch them into a 3D image and then load those into a piece of software and then turn them into a model of a home. So it was a lot of work, 30, 40 hours to do a model of a house. And at that time, 2015, Atlantic Canada, houses were selling for an average of maybe 150 Canadian dollars. They were sitting on the market for 2 years because it was a total buyer's market. There was too much supply. And so real estate agents just were not willing to pay very much for that service. So I experienced very early on a service business that had terrible margins and the struggle of trying to work through that problem and answer the questions that every agency needs to answer at some point in time, which is things like, are we actually making money on any of these projects and services? What would it cost me to hire other people to do this? And how would the margins look then? And, when and how much should we hire for people? And are we charging enough? And is our team busy enough? And very early on in that business, I kind of recognized that there wasn't enough margin in that service for it to scale. And the technology pipeline was going to basically wipe out agencies that did this. At that time, Matterport was just coming out. Anyway, so I moved on from that business and got interested in software. It's how I met Dan Martel, who we both know. And then eventually he introduced me to the original co-founder in the business, who's still an investor. His name is Jared. He ran a software dev agency, and he called me up and said, "Hey, look, I've got about 2 days a week dedicated to just crunching numbers to answer all these questions that I just ran through. There has to be a better way to do this. Every other friend that I know that runs an agency has the same problem." And I resonated with the problem right away. We started doing customer development and talking to agencies. Everybody we spoke to, this was an unsolved problem. And so that's kind of what got us into it initially. And it's been a very interesting, almost 7 years, 6.5 years now that we've been working on this, trying to find product market fit and really a scalable solution to this very complex problem.
Right. Yeah. So kind of a scratch your own itch sort of start, where you said, hey, there's a real problem we have, and I think others have that as well.
To some degree, yeah, that's pretty much how it happened.
Yeah, I want to dive into that in more specifics on some of the advice and some of the action items you would recommend to folks. But before we do that, I just want to zoom out a little bit and touch on the beekeeper part. Okay, so as a part-time beekeeper, biohacking enthusiast, how do those passions influence your work or maybe even mindset as an entrepreneur?
So I got into beekeeping through my partner, my wife, who bought a beekeeping business about a year ago, bought an apiary. And so, it's not something that I was necessarily interested in, but I'm an investor in that business. And so I play an active role. And the more you learn about bees and honey, you just can't help but be fascinated by it. It's really quite incredible. So, And what was really interesting about that was I was aware that honey, had some health benefits, but I didn't really understand to the extent to which it has health benefits and just how much research is being done on honey for things like treating cancer and increasing cellular regeneration and mitochondrial function and cognitive decline. Like it's really incredible. And so that really coincided well with this thing that I already had going, which was just this maniacal focus on biohacking, which I think really started as a way to try to biohack my way out of burning out in the early days of Parakeeto, but is now kind of turned into this passion that it really comes from this place of like, now that I know what it's like to feel really good all the time, I really don't like feeling suboptimal. And so I spend a lot of time and energy on trying to constantly tweak aspects of my life so that I just feel good as often as possible, and so I can live as long as possible. So, I'm definitely like a Brian Johnson fanboy. I'm definitely a Huberman Lab stan. I shamelessly will admit to those things. It's something I really enjoy.
Yeah, it's cool. Yeah, I can resonate with that personally. I have a Whoop myself, and I saw in your headshot you had a Whoop, and I think on the other side you have what is it, a Fitbit?
At one point, I was rocking 2 separate fitness trackers and comparing the data.
Yeah. So one Whoop, one out, huh?
Yeah, Whoop ended up, well, mostly because the Fitbit stopped working, which I've found to be a theme with Fitbit products. They're inexpensive, but it's generally for a reason. And yeah, I did like the insights in Whoop a little bit better.
Yeah, that's cool. All right, so let's dive into profitability a little bit more. What are the most common mistakes agencies make when trying to measure or improve profitability?
Yeah, there's a lot of them, but I think the most fundamental, I'll kind of go through. There's 3 components that I believe need to be in place for an agency to adopt what we call profit management. And those 3 elements are, number 1, they need to have the data available to measure their profitability. And in some cases, not all of that data is available or being created. So typically the sets of data, there's 4. You need to have some finance information, right? So most people have that, because if they don't have finance information, that means they're not filing their taxes, in which case they're probably going to end up in jail. So most people have finance. But then there's 3 other sets of data that are more operational, that are more important than finance data actually for profitability analysis, but they're often overlooked. And that is a set of data about people that really helps us understand what is our capacity, right? So who are the people on our team? What kind of skill sets do they have? How much do they work? How much time off do they get? How much are they paid? And that really is the most important thing to understand, because it is the basis of our entire business model. Anybody that sells services, you're in the business of buying time in bulk from people and reselling it at a profit. And so if you don't understand your primary resource, which is the team that you have, that's a massive gap in your understanding of your own business model and what it's capable of. So people data is number 1, project data is number 2. So that's understanding all of the assumptions that are being made about work that's incoming, how much you're being paid, how much of that money is actually yours to earn, what you expect to spend to earn that money, how much time is going to be required so you can reconcile that against the time you have available on your team, right? It's basic stuff, but there's not a lot of critical thinking that goes into this a lot of the time. And then the third piece of operational data is time tracking. So those first 2 sets I mentioned, people and projects, we can make a lot of assumptions using those 2 sets of data, and we can clarify what we expect to happen in the business. But there's also this critical piece of saying, well, let's measure what's actually happening. We do that partially by using finance data, but at a more precise level, we have to use time tracking data so we can understand who was busier or less busy than we expected, what projects took more or less time and therefore were more or less profitable than we expected. And spotting those outliers is how we can actually get very deliberate and focused about closing gaps that are causing us to leak profitability, but also identifying opportunities where if we were to double down on those things, we could dramatically improve profitability. So it kind of goes both ways. So that's step number 1, is having those 4 sets of data available within the business, consistently being produced with all the necessary metadata to then plug into the next 2 requirements and actually be able to get insight from that.
Got
Pause
it.
there.
Yeah. Where does someone start? There's a lot of different things to consider. What's step 1?
So in order to talk about this, actually, no, I'll talk about this first and then we can go into the other 2 pieces. So there is sequencing to all of this. And I think the mistake that I see a lot of people make when they are kind of starting from nothing or they're really struggling with this is they jump right to trying to track time and really throw more time and resources at their finances and track actuals. And the challenge with that is by far the most complex, the most expensive, and the longest to pay back, because often you need to amass a certain amount of data in order to get insight from that data. And the other challenge with that is it's very hard to understand what the structure of that data needs to look like until you've resolved the other two, which is how you think about people and how you think about projects, right? So the thing I always talk about here is insight is a function of understanding what's actually happening and reconciling that against what you expected to happen. Having only one or the other, you can't get full insight. And I think people listening will have experienced this, where it's like you get a report from your accountant and they say, oh, your profitability was X and your gross margin was Y. And maybe even you have some operational data, or your utilization was this and your project profitability was that. But without having an understanding of what you expected it to be, you can't really interpret or act on that insight, right? So, oh, our utilization was 50%. Well, is that good or is it bad? And it's impossible to answer that question unless you understand, oh, well, theoretically, it could have been 60 and we ended up at 50. That's an execution problem. Whereas if you realize, oh, our model theoretically capped out at 42% and we achieved 50, well, that means you executed extremely well, but you have a business model challenge. Like, those are two very different problems, but you can't get that insight unless you have both sides of the equation, which is the plan and the insight. So from a sequencing perspective, we always start with the plan first. And we start with the plan for a couple of reasons. The first is you can't determine the correct structure for time tracking and finance data until you know how you're structuring your assumptions to begin with. The second piece is you can't really get value from the time tracking and finance data until you understand what you expected to happen and what theoretically the business was capable of. And the third piece is that it's much faster because you don't often need to create net new information. You just need to structure assumptions that you were already going to be aware of in a way that allows you to get clarity on that plan. You don't have to go like evaluate, purchase, install, and then wait 3 months to track time, for example. You can just sit down one day and say, okay, let me list out all of this information that I already have about my team in such a way that I can then understand things like capacity and utilization targets and budgets, for how much we're spending, for example. So it's a bit of a long answer to your question, but hopefully an insightful one in thinking through how to sequence this. And the TLDR is start with the plan, start with understanding your fundamental model, which is a function of your team first and foremost, and then how you think about your planned work and how much work is coming into the business.
And who is this for? Who's the person that's taking this on? Is this a group effort? Is this one person?
Man, that is a good question. And this is one of the biggest problems that we have identified and we're setting out to solve at Parakeeto is in a small boutique firm. And when I say that, I mean like less than 100 people. It's not clear whose job this is. And the reason it's not clear is because, unfortunately, the old way of thinking about this function in the business is that it's finance's responsibility. And there used to be this way of thinking of work and data flows linearly through an organization. So sales goes out and sells new things, then delivery does those new things, and then all of that flows to finance and they tally up what happened and then report on profitability. And that made sense when everything was billed by the hour because you could only ever really assess profitability in a retroactive way. But in this modern context, very few firms purely bill on time and materials. Even the ones that do, there rarely is actually a one-to-one coupling between time and materials. Like, you often end up working hours that you don't get paid for. Like, there isn't a perfect relationship there. And the model of the business is intrinsically dynamic in that changes to sales influences delivery, changes to delivery influences sales and finance. Like, these things are interconnected. So you kind of end up in this no man's land where it's like, well, do I ask the finance team to try to understand operations and sales well enough to reconcile these things? Do I ask operations to try and stretch? Like, any one of those people is not really going to be qualified or comfortable sitting in the middle and trying to bring all of these things together. And usually in a small firm, you don't have the resources to build the function that actually should be doing that job, which is called data operations. And in an enterprise company or like a modern SaaS company, for example, there's a team of data scientists and data engineers, and they have enterprise software and a data lake. And that's all they do all day is collect, clean, transform, normalize, analyze, report on data, and work with stakeholders to make sure they have the information that they need and that they're kind of making sense of the entire organization. You could also think about that as management accounting, but the long and short is it's not clear whose job that is. what we often see is that either the finance or the operations department is kind of told, you need to figure this out. And then it's often a very daunting task to be able to get enough understanding, context, and input from the other departments that they're not based in to actually make all of this make sense and work in a streamlined way.
Got it. Yeah. And who's your ideal kind of customer profile? Like, we both work with agencies, but there's a wide range of agencies. What does that look like? And then kind of a follow-up question is, can you give an example of maybe how you've been able to work with one of those agencies or how they've been able to consume some of your information and make a change? I'd love to hear if there's an example or story.
Yeah, we have a fairly broad spectrum of firms that we've worked with, both in terms of discipline and in terms of size. But I would say that like our sweet spot that we exist to serve is kind of in that, let's call it 2 million in revenue up to probably 10 or 15, where you're basically trapped in this no man's land of you have enough scale that you really need to start focusing more on these metrics and understanding your profitability. And you're now also probably building layers of management that need some form of objective accountability and feedback on how they're performing. But you're not in a position where you have the resources to adopt enterprise software, pay full-time engineers and data scientists to run a data operation. And so you're kind of in this gap. That's what we've designed our business to fill, is essentially taking data operations, bringing it down market, and doing it in a way that's accessible and specialized for professional services. And then in terms of specialization, if you sell creative or digital services, that's essentially the sweet spot that we like to work in. We have done some work in adjacent, consulting or finance or even legal, but we tend to focus on creative or digital agencies, the majority of them doing things like building and designing websites, doing branding, selling digital advertising, those kinds of things.
Got it. What sets Parakeeto apart from other competitors? Because I imagine there's others in this space trying to solve the same problem. What do you feel like is different?
That's interesting because I don't think there is anyone else doing this.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I
think it's kind of what it came back to what I talked about earlier, which is for a long time, everybody's seen this as a finance problem, but it's not a finance problem. And actually, like when you look at how we run a profitability management system, finance is the least important set of data in that entire process. And I think historically, people have looked to finance or looked to fractional CFOs to try and solve this problem. And when they started realizing that that's not really going to work, that operations data is actually critical in this, often the pendulum swings to, let's just invest in project management and time tracking tools. But they kind of end up in this same problem, which is they have all this data, but they're missing the other two components that make a profit management system effective, which is a framework and a process around that framework. And we have certainly seen some finance firms that specialize in agencies start to embrace the operations data, but I haven't seen anyone that does the thing that we do, which is actually take ownership of making sure that data is clean, properly structured, and maintained over time. So the critical issue is, let's say I go hire, and I could name some like Summit CPA, Upsourced Accounting, there's some amazing firms out there. We speak the same language. They do great work. The trouble is, if I can't, as the client, give them clean data so that they can calculate and interpret things like utilization and client profitability, then they're not in a position to get all the way into the weeds of my organization and make sure that my data is clean. That's out of scope for them. And it's not something that they're interested in doing because it sucks. It's really hard work. But that's the work that we do, is we really take ownership of that and basically install a data operation that makes sure that data coming out of the ops side of the business is clean. And it's designed to fit into a framework that speaks the same language as finance and sales and makes all of those things work together in terms of metrics and how those things are measured. So I guess that's what makes us different, is that we've built technology, but we also have a managed service that works with that technology to actually take full ownership of the cleanliness of your data as it relates to measuring profitability.
So you have a software product that you guys have built that ties into these principles.
Yeah. It's so funny because I said to somebody the other day, it's like, you could almost think of us like bench accounting. That's a really bad example to use right now because obviously they just imploded. But what I mean by that is that, yes, we have built this platform to help us bring all of this data together and do all the things that you need to do to get data to be clean, quality assurance, stitching, normalization, creating structured data tables, cleanup rules, all those kind of things. And we provide a managed consulting service on top of that. So you can almost think of us like bookkeepers for your project management and time tracking and people data. That's essentially how I would describe one of the key pieces of what we do. And we also layer coaching and advisory on top of that. So we'll help you actually look at the data and understand what it means, how you might act on it, what this means in terms of finance, what this means in terms of sales. So it's really kind of a full solution in that respect.
Right. So you give them the tools, but then you also come in there as sort of an advisor or coach to help them make the use of those insights.
Right. And I think the idea behind that is, it comes back to the question you asked earlier, which was a good one, is whose job is this? And in an organization where it's like, it's not really anybody's job and no one really wants to do that job, we say, don't worry, we'll do that job. So you can all just kind of go focus on being the CFO, being the COO, being the CEO, and we'll kind of facilitate the conversation between the three of you to make sure everyone's on the same page. And then you can go back to executing on the higher leverage stuff.
So what about the time tracking piece? Is that something you guys have in your software, or is that something you tie into other tools?
No, that's a great question. It's not something that we do. It's not something we ever plan to do. It's a very solved problem, as I'm sure you know, and the long tail of time tracking and project management and bottom up resource planning tools and finance tools, like that's a very mature market. And so, we don't try to replace any of those things. We're agnostic. Our platform is really meant to pull data from all of those things and make sure that it's clean and usable for reporting. And importantly, I think this is part of the reason we've taken this unconventional approach, because conventional wisdom is, the way that you get good reports is you pull data from those tools into a reporting system. The challenge is there's always data cleanliness issues. Things change. You used to use this time tracking tool, then you switch to this other one. And then within that time tracking tool, the PM team wanted to set projects up this way, but then 6 months later, they decided they wanted to set projects up a different way. So the naming convention is different and the hierarchy is different and the use of objects is different. And so it's like, how do you make sure that your reporting doesn't break at every one of those junctures? Well, the answer is you have an extract, a transform step. That's where our software and our process comes in. And then you load that into reports. And what I think is a fool's errand is trying to create all of that hygiene at the data input. So making sure that everybody always perfectly inputs their time entries every single time and never makes mistakes. I've literally never seen that work once in 6 years across hundreds of organizations. And I think that that's kind of the fundamental flaw in a lot of people's thinking when they start designing a system, is they set it up in a way that is inevitably going to fail, which is if they don't have perfection at the input level, then they have data that can't be trusted at the output level. And it's a really, really good way to spend 90% of the time, money, and energy building a system and get less than 10% of the value out of that exercise. It's really a punishing experience to go through.
Yeah. So how long does the ramp up period, say someone, they want to solve this problem and they want to work with you. How long does it take to get that plan in place to start taking action and seeing results?
It's a good question. A lot less time than it used to take. And this is because it comes back to the sequencing we talked about earlier. The first thing that we do is we have a 3-step process. The first step is we want to understand the model of the business. And the model of the business is primarily based on people data. So the first thing that we do is we sit down, we say, okay, let's list out everybody on your team. Let's get an understanding of the freelancers, the white label partners that you have. Like, let's really build out an understanding of what is the best possible outcome for your business based on the people you have, the amount of time that they work, how much you charge for things, and what your, rough budgets are for spending on overhead and other things. That gives us a first baseline of here's the best outcome for the business. And we reconcile that against, is this what you want, ownership team? And you'd be amazed at how often we'll do that analysis and show that to an ownership team and say, hey, here you go. If everything went perfectly, no mistakes, you would have a 23% net profit. And they go, oh, we set our target at 30% this year. And it's like, okay, well, that is a challenge that we should address. And it's a good thing we figured that out first, because if you had gone through this year and ended up at 23%, you would have thought that you had a failure of execution. But the reality is you would have executed perfectly, flawlessly, but you would have failed to plan appropriately and understand your model. So step one is understand the model. Step two is then forecast. So that's when we start layering in planned work and understanding, okay, these are our targets. Are we on track to hit that? Are we on track to hit our utilization target? Are we on track to hit our profitability on projects because we're selling them with the right margins up front? Are we on track to accomplish our revenue targets, our gross margin targets, our overhead targets? So that's step two. And then step three is we then say, okay, now that we have an understanding of our model, we have an understanding of if we're on track at any given period of time, now let's layer in time tracking and start figuring out where the outliers are. And that sequential process allows us to, usually within 10 days, deliver the model and get a lot of insight from that. Within 2 weeks of that, we have a functional forecasting model and a very, very objective way of understanding what we expect margins to be on projects when we sell them. And then usually 2 to 3 weeks from there, we've got time tracking data flowing into the system. And part of that is going to be determined by, do they already have time tracking in place? Do they not? Like, how much investment do we need to make in getting that up and running? But that sequencing is important because we don't have to wait until the end of the process to get insight. We're getting insight all throughout, and we're getting it in the sequence that is important and appropriate to kind of making sure we address the low-hanging fruit and the biggest issues first before we get into the details.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting. You work with a lot of agencies. We work with a lot of agencies. I feel like the landscape has been shifting a little bit, especially with some of the AI changes. The economy is a little wonky. We want predictability, which is part of what you're talking about. And I'm just curious, what do you see in the future for agencies? Is there any way that they can maybe future-proof themselves a little bit more with this kind of ever-changing landscape?
I think you're going to like my answer to this question, Adam. And so I'll preface this answer by saying that Adam and I have no formal affiliation or partnership. I'm not incentivized to say things that benefit Adam and his business model. But what I can tell you is that in auditing hundreds of agencies over the last couple of years, what has been empirically true is that the agencies that have been by far the most profitable are the ones that have internally specialized. And so what I mean by that is they've identified as an organization not just who they sell to, that's their external specialization. So we sell to, B2B software companies, and we help them solve this specific problem. That's an external specialization. What they've also done is they've looked internally and they've said, okay, we're really good at sales, account management, and strategy, and we're really bad at executing on copywriting, design, and engineering. Every time we try to engineer something, it gets messed up. We go way over budget. We lose all of our margin. And then they make the decision to say, okay, we're going to only staff internally for the things that we're really good at. And we're going to partner with other firms that are experts at the things that we're not good at. So we're still delivering a complete solution to that problem, but operationally we're specializing. Those firms have been by far the most profitable. And so I think that we've been talking about external specialization and pricing models almost exclusively as vehicles to improve our margins over the last decade in this industry. I think at this point, we can agree that that's just table stakes. Like, everyone is doing that. And if you're not doing that, you probably won't be around much longer. So the next phase is, okay, what's the next thing that we have to do to protect our margins? Because they're going to keep getting worse. And to me, it's going to follow the same curve that every industry follows, which is the supply chain gets more and more fragmented. And people within that supply chain become more and more specialized at an operational function. And you're going to see way more firms that lean into either being a white label partner or focusing on being really efficient at execution because that's their skill set, and more firms that focus on kind of just being the sales and strategy and front facing part of this. And they're going to collaborate on the back end. And you'll probably see that become even more fragmented over time. That's where I think things are headed. And I know this, I believe this very strongly because the numbers back it up in terms of our analysis and how profitable those firms are that are doing this already.
Well, thanks for the nod to our business model there. I appreciate it. And yeah, just to echo what you're saying, I mean, yeah, I see it too. And as far as the intangibles as well, I mean, for our business model, we work with over 100 different agencies. Over the years, we've just seen certain patterns where once we see that pattern enough, we go, okay, well, I'll give you an example. Some agencies are really good with managing scope. If there's a scope change that comes in after the development's done, we let them know how much that is per hour. We bill for that. They charge the client. Everyone's happy. Some agencies, they think that should be in scope, those changes last minute after the house is already built, so to speak. And that's an example of, educating that partner. And it's not just letting them know, hey, that's something we need to bill for after the fact, but because we've seen that pattern so many times, we can now be proactive and say, hey, this is a brand new partnership we're starting here. Can we maybe do a lunch and learn and give you guys tools and tips so that you guys can, have a better operation on your side of things? And those are just value adds that we can offer that have just come through the process of working with so many different agencies. So just to your point, like when you become a true expert and you do something over and over and over, there's all these other secondary and tertiary benefits that you can then add as a true expert and value provider to the partners you work with.
Yeah. I think what's also true here is that at a more fundamental level, most organizations have a DNA and a culture, and it is often set by the founding team in terms of like what comes naturally to them. And so you're going to have some firms where the ownership team is just wired for efficiency. And that's just what comes naturally to them. They're great at process and resource planning, and they're really on top of their metrics, and like all of this stuff comes naturally to them. Where you'll have this other firm where maybe you have like some brilliant creatives, but they're very aloof. They don't really care too much about process. They don't pay attention to it. Everything's a little bit chaotic. And it's not to say that one is better than the other, but I think it's important to become more mindful of like, what are our natural tendencies? That's going to set the culture at the organization. And that, I think, increasingly should start to influence the business strategy and start to help people make these deliberate choices about like, hey, you know what, we're not going to try to be a brand sales driven organization. We're going to just lean into this competency that we have at being really good at operations, so that firms like the aloof creative one, they don't have to be. And we can kind of combine and have the sum be great, or the totality of this thing be greater than the sum of its parts, because we get to internally specialize in the same way that like when you look at a crowded category like airlines, for example, they're all airlines, but they all have different specializations where, Southwest is going to be all about the customer experience, and Emirates is going to be a luxury brand, and, Spirit's going to be super budget. And it's like everyone's positioned, and then you see that permeate through their culture and their DNA. And at this point, you see that they look for those qualities in their leadership. I think you're going to kind of see a similar thing in agency for this reason as well.
Yeah. It makes sense. Wow. Well, really good conversation. I'm just curious, what if someone could take away, we've talked about a lot of things, one actionable insight from this conversation, what would you want it to be?
Yeah, it's interesting because we didn't really get into the specific metrics. So I'm going to plug that for a moment. Sure. Like if listening to this, you're like, I would really like to know what metrics I need to track and how to set the targets for those things. I want to encourage you to head to parakeeto.com/toolkit, and you can get all of that at no cost. I think the biggest thing that I would encourage people to take away from this is that the sequencing matters when you're approaching this. So based on what we've talked about here, if you're struggling with profitability, trying to track more things is probably not the right answer. The first step is to understand what you expect of your business model and really understand your business model. And so that's what I would encourage everyone to do, is start with really sitting down, getting understanding of your people, your capacity, how much revenue you would expect them to earn, how profitable you would be if everything went perfectly, before you then spend a lot of time trying to dial in your finances, dial in your time tracking, because you'll get a lot of insight very quickly and at a very low cost from doing that first exercise. And it will also improve the value that you get from that much harder and more long-term exercise. And again, if you want to learn how to do all of that stuff, that's all free in the toolkit. And, we have videos that walk you through how to do that, and free tools that help you do it actually as well.
Super helpful. Yeah. Let's tell everyone, where can they find you? Where do they follow along and check out?
I would say LinkedIn is probably the best place if you're on social media. I'm also on Instagram, but I'm most active on LinkedIn for this topic. If you like podcasts, we also have a podcast called the Agency Profit Podcast. You'll never guess what we talk about there. And of course, if you want to dive into a bunch of free resources, we have tons of blogs and free tools on our website, parakeeto.com. So I encourage you to check that out if you want to dive into this subject matter for yourself.
Awesome. Thanks, Marcel. Really appreciate having you on, and thanks for sharing all the insights.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Thank you for listening to the Pixel Perfect podcast, where we go down the rabbit hole on the journey and motivations of creatives and entrepreneurs. Stay tuned for more stories to come. Until next time.